Hello, this tutorial is on the ratio sequencer, part of the default language in Sema. The ratio sequencer is a more advanced sequencer. In the previous tutorial we looked at the basic kind of core sequencing functions, which are CLT, which emits triggers, CLP, which emits phasers, all synchronized to the main clock, and CLK, which manages the speed and bar length of the main audio engine clock. These are the kind of building blocks of sequencing in Sema, and the ratio sequencer sits on top of these things to build more complex sequences. Let's jump in straight away and see how this works. So I've got an example here I'm going to copy straight from the tutorial. If you watched the last tutorial, you'll know that CLP emits a phaser at a frequency relative to the bar. So this CLP here is emitting a phaser of 1 cycle per bar. The ratio sequencer is in this function called RSQ. It takes at least 2 parameters, and in this case it's going to emit triggers. With CLP or CLT we can only get regularly spaced triggers, and what the ratio sequencer gives us the ability to do is to make intricate kind of custom timing between the triggers instead of just regular spacing. So here we've got 2 parameters. The first is this phaser. So we've got a phaser rising from 0 to 1 once per bar, and then the second parameter is an array, a list of numbers. This might be the first time that we've covered arrays in the tutorial. So if we want to make a list of numbers in the Sema default language, then we enclose it in square brackets like this. Here we've got a list of numbers, and these are the ratios that we give to our sequencer. And how it works is like this. As this phaser rises from 0 to 1, we divide that time period into the ratios here. And at the start of each block, we emit a trigger. So if we give it 1, 1 as a sequence here, what we're going to do is divide the phaser into 2 blocks of equal size, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio, and at the start of each of those blocks we'll emit a trigger. So this will emit 1 trigger at the start of the phaser and 1 trigger halfway through. Let's hear what that sounds like. If I change this, I'll just turn up the volume slightly. So I can mess around these ratios to get different rhythms. If I just have the number 1 there, then it will divide the bar into 1 piece and emit a trigger at the start of that. If I put 3 ratios here, so in this case we'd be dividing the bar into 3 equal sizes and emitting a trigger at the start of each one, then we'll start to get triplets compared to the previous rhythm. So this is all just similar to the clock trigger really. We're emitting equal sized gaps between the triggers. But what if we have slightly different size ratios? So here I can do a 2-to-1 ratio. I'm just going to go through a bunch of different ratios and kind of show you, demo how this works, so you'll be able to hear what these numbers are doing. So, as you might be able to hear, that this is a pretty flexible way of creating rhythms. We can also use the ratio sequencer for sequencing values, not just triggers. Let's have a look at an example of how this works. So what we're doing here is we're adding a third parameter to the ratio sequencer, to RSQ. And this is another list of values. And here's how this works. This part of the ratio sequencer, as we've seen before, emits triggers in a certain rhythm. When we have a third parameter, what this does, every time there's a trigger, we take a value from this list, and we keep looping round these values. So if I just play this, what you're going to hear is we're going to have, so 4 times per bar, we're just going to cycle through, we're going to pull a note from this list. These are frequencies which are going to get sent to this saw wave. So what that was doing was just cycling through this list, these octave frequencies. Just like the triggering version of the ratio sequencer, if we change the rhythm here, it'll change the rhythm of the triggers which pull values from this list. So let's try a few different rhythms to see how this works. We can also change the speed of the oscillator, or the phaser here, to change the speed at which we cycle through the list. There are a few other examples of how you can use this in the help section in the tutorial. This example, we sequence a filter, so we're generating frequencies here, and then we've got a square wave, and we use those frequencies to change the cutoff of a filter. This one, we control a distortion. So we've got a hi-hat here. This is controlled by an impulse, so it's not clock synchronized. 8 times a second, and we're sending impulses into this ratio sequencer, which is cycling through this list of values to control the distortion level on the hi-hat. Let's see what that sounds like. In Sema, everything is a signal, so the numbers that we give to the ratio sequencer don't have to be fixed. In this example from the tutorial, we are triggering a 909 sample, but we're using a phaser to control one of the values. So we generate triggers here, and we're sequencing the speed with a ratio sequencer, but one of these values is varying over time. So that's another example of how you can use this sequencing system. So it all amounts to it being fairly flexible, you can control the speed and the values and the rhythm of the sequencer either with fixed numbers or with other signals. So you can kind of build up quite complex sequences in this style. As with everything in Sema, the best way to get to know these functions is to go and play with them, experiment with them, start simply, build up complexity, and go and make a piece with them. Then you'll really feel like you understand how they work.